this idea of individualism is something that needs to be unpacked, right? It's a complex concept somehow, but leaving that aside for just a second, one can say that yes, the new platforms and new cultural spirit or ethos of everybody having the right to express themselves, and everyone has something to say. Everybody should have a voice. There are probably a lot of positive aspects to this, right? Maybe the negative aspect is that it encourages everyone to seek to be their own, to express their own identity, which there are two parts of that. One, we are all copies of one another to some extent, right? Everybody living in a certain era is going to be influenced by certain things, and there's a question about how much of this is sort of variations on the same, this individualism, right? The other aspect is just that if we're all trying to express our own voice, then how do we come together to do something collective, right? And in the past, there was a very imperfect and very problematic process that excluded women and minorities, and also, I'm not trying to glorify the past by any means, but music in the past, there was somehow some musicians felt themselves, I think, more to be at the intersection between a collective processes and individual processes, and there was a sense that you know, try making a bunch of people dance alone with an acoustic guitar, right? It's not so easy. It works a lot better if you've got a fiddle and a banjo there with you, right? So there was a certain pressure just in terms of making something richer, sonically, or more powerful, to collaborating with other people. There was also this sense of a way of, there were techniques and technologies for making the music work that needed to be learned and passed down collectively. So if you were a young guitar player living somewhere 100 years ago, there was no YouTube or there was no way to learn other than by playing with other musicians, and there was no way to gain sort of the knowledge of how to make the music work. Also on the audience, in terms of creating a good show or connecting with the audience, the stagecraft, all this stuff this experience had to be acquired firsthand. And in acquiring this experience firsthand, you were participating in the conservation of the music that had come before, right? You couldn't go out and get a gig playing by yourself from the beginning, or you couldn't create music and put it up on SoundCloud and gain a following that way. You had to go and play music with other people, and then you learned other people's songs. And it was very common all the way up until the 60s and 70s for established artists spent a lot of time learning other people's music. They had learned it growing up, and there was not this pressure to express always themselves. Everybody, Aretha Franklin covered the Beatles and all sorts of people, right? And this was again another piece of this, to relate it back to the whole economic aspect of the culture, is copyright law.
Yeah, I was going to say this exactly. Yeah.
Right, and so all of us now as creators feel like the only way that we can potentially make a living is to make sure that we, claim the 10% credit for that bridge on that person's song, or better yet, write the whole song ourselves, right? Yeah. And there's much less of an incentive. Back in the day, if there was a great song that had been made, you could make a lot of money and tour based on a great cover of that song, right? In an interesting way, we're seeing that come around again now somehow with the remixes thing, but again, it's now been transformed. So yeah, that's a long answer to your question about this thing about individualism. But I do think that is a big part of it. Is this the technology now makes it possible for a musician to, from his or her bedroom, without only by coming into contact with music through recordings. There are the tutorials. There's a drummer in Logic who you can tell him to play different beats.
There's a bunch of them, like Jake who plays funk, and Miranda who plays this, and
and so you can actually get quite a long way in terms of creating something that's nominally yours, right? Just the way you can use filters on Instagram to create individualistic looking photos without actually learning the things about photography you would have needed to know to be a Man Ray in the past, right? I think the same thing happens now, where we have the technology to give us sort of the illusion that we're creating something individualistic, whereas in fact, because we don't go through this exploratory process with other people as much, we end up producing a lot of very same sounding music.
Yeah, what you're saying is really interesting, and I feel like in a sense there is a divide between me and you, in the sense that you are a modern musician, but in many ways I'm a postmodern musician, because I'm like a YouTube, internet taught musician, and I really like the paradox that you seem to be outlining, that in a society where we're all with not as much limitations, you're able to create a show all by yourself, that because you're not limited by instrumentations or the acoustic and physical limits of one specific instruments. But yeah, there is this paradox that paradoxically we're all different in the same way, whereas before, as a band was a means sometimes to transcend this and to create something different together.
Yeah, and even if you were playing not your song, right?
Yeah.
Even if you were playing someone else's song, or a standard in the case of jazz, this act of being together and combining your energies produced a different kind of individuality.
But about that, there is a documentary, I don't know if you heard about it, about copyright law and how it completely changed music and hip-hop especially. I don't know if you heard about that. For example, the fact that hip-hop was born on block parties in America, and so people would use bits and pieces of like funk tracks and disco tracks and remix them all together, but it proved to be a legal nightmare. So then the sampling scene became, instead of sampling 20 songs in one new remix, you would sample 3 and get the rights for this.
Yeah.
So that's a good example on how the legal situation and paradigm completely shaped the music. And I don't know if you know this lawyer, Larry, I don't have his name anymore, but he's a super famous lawyer, and he gave a TED Talk, I think about 10 years ago, when he predicted memes and stuff like that, and that whole remix scene. And we are in a weird situation, because on the one hand, it's never been easier to be in a meme-making, cross-pollinating creation of things, of new artistic artifacts that are standing on the shoulders of giants. And on the other hand, it doesn't fit with the legal paradigm in which we are. So there is this like weird dissonance and distortion that you can really see through, for example, the whole downloading problems that we had in the past few years. And
yeah, and I don't have much expertise in that area. So I mean, I think the only thing I can add to that is just I myself have often thought that I would be in a different era. I would have been probably more satisfied with the role of interpreter, or by nature I'm a collaborator, and I would have been I probably constitutionally would have been thrilled just to be interpreting other people's music and expressing myself and my individuality through my guitar playing and through my reinterpretations of other people's material. For me, one of the greatest musicians of the 20th century, hands down, is Nina Simone, because of how powerful her reinterpretations are. They're often better than her original material, which is also, a lot of it is great, but she put such a strong stamp she transformed it to the point of being unrecognizable sometimes, or you couldn't imagine anybody else singing this, or like what the original version could have been. And that's just as powerful to me, a form of artistry, just as much as expressed, or the audience is just as moved by that as by watching somebody sing something they've created completely themselves. I feel like it's a compromise that I've sort of made with this moment, to feel like, well, it's somehow as a format for me to sing and play songs on the guitar. This is something I enjoy. In order to have a career doing this, I need to write my own songs, and that feels like my compromise with this moment that we're in somehow.
Yeah, it feels to me like we're losing this idea of a standard.
Absolutely. I mean, people do. There's still, there's a hit song that comes out every year that gets remixed a bunch of times, and then it gets swept away by the next stuff. And this can all sound incredibly depressing and incredibly sort of atavistic. And I want to be sure to say that I don't feel like I can really pass judgment completely on the present moment, because again, one of the positive aspects of this democratization of the means of production and means of expression for music is that anybody can make a recording, and anybody, and the hip hop music itself is the perfect example of like people who would not had a voice, or who would have never gotten into the recording studio, making something really, really powerful and beautiful, without the proper musical training, and without having gone through the bands that they were, without all this stuff. So it's really hard. It's really hard to
parse the pros and the cons.
To parse the pros and the cons.
But it's just, we are kind of not saying that the future is dark, but just saying that there are pros and cons to everything, and that in some ways there are some things that, despite all the advantages that we now have and all the progress that has been made, some things are lost.
Absolutely, tremendous things are being lost, and I think it's also fair to ask whether people who feel like the best days in terms of certain heights of virtuosic musical achievement, that those days are behind us. I think that could be true. I mean, I look at Indian classical music, for example, which really is probably, to me, the deepest of all of the musical traditions, probably outside of Western classical music, and I'd say jazz is the closest competition. Indian classical music really comes from a completely patriarchal kind of social environment, right, where a master musician is waited upon by his family and by his students, and the students come for 10 years to study under this guru, and of course the guru doesn't clean or cook or do anything. The guru meditates and develops the ability to play 64th notes at I don't know how many BPM, and this is a miracle of human ability that this music was created. But the social conditions necessary for its creation are pretty problematic. And I think you can look at orchestras, you can look at a lot of things in the past in that way, making pressuring your child to start playing the violin at age 3 is
the Suzuki method
is also a pretty ethically, it's not an ethically unambiguous thing to do. And I would be curious now to meet the parents who are still trying to put their children through that kind of an education, because it's making a huge life decision for your child before they have any kind of adult consciousness to choose their own, to make choices themselves. So that we have some kinds of artistic achievements that rest on ethically dubious or ambiguous situations is, I think, something we have to be honest about.
It's
right?
Interesting, yeah.
When
tiger parenting.
Yeah, and I mean, you know,
But also Michael Jackson would be an example of that, right?
of course, exactly.
Yeah,
And
his family and
you know, the other ethically ambiguous context that created really, really transcendently beautiful music was, of course, slavery and the way that African Americans were treated. One can have this conversation about drug abuse as well, whether, you know, all the people, the Billie Holidays and the Charlie Parkers and all the people who were dead by the time they were 40 something, you know, whether this suffering that they had, that then was sort of the drugs that they took, sort of made it possible for them to keep creating while living with this pain, and that then this whole complex of pain is what gets expressed through the music. I think it's a legitimate question to ask whether, you know, on balance, we would be better off having more fewer drug addicts and maybe music that is, it's going to be different, you know. And I that's what I try to embrace as my philosophy of the future. We probably won't have a Coltrane. We won't have a Coltrane again. We won't have a Ravi Shankar again. We're gonna have something else, you know. It's gonna be different.